What's going on, everybody? Thank you all so much for tuning into this live stream segment of Mikasa Sukase, and I am your humble host, Niko House. Today, we have a very special guest with us. A lot of you may not have heard of her campaign, but you've definitely heard of her mayoral seat because she is running to replace former mayor or current mayor, but will be former mayor Pete Buttigieg. And today we have with us Regina Williams-Preston. How are you doing, Miss Regina?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, no problem. No problem. So you are running for the mayoral position in South Bend, correct?
Right.
What is the primary function of the mayor there? Because I know in every city and every municipality, it's different depending on how your city council and commissioner set up. So like, what would be your primary responsibilities?
Well, it's the executive office. So I've been on the city council now for the last 4 years. That's the legislative body. But in the mayor's role, it's really about making sure everything's functioning correctly. And of course, putting together the budget, allocating those dollars in a way that makes sense for our community.
So your council and mayoral, like y'all actually act as commissioner as well then?
Right, kind of as checks and balances for each other to make sure. So the mayor is going to put together the budget. The city council has to approve that budget. So right now, as a city council person, I'm representing my district, District 2, and basically just making sure that however that $400 million or so is spent, that it's spent in a way that is about priorities for the people.
Did you just say 400 million?
Yeah, about $400 million.
In Indiana?
In South Bend, Indiana.
Oh my goodness gracious! I did not know it. Can I hold $1? I mean, I'll give it back when I'm done. That is a lot of money and a lot of responsibility. And so, have you been on the city council before? Is that why you know how everything works so well?
No, actually, I kind of came to politics late to speak. I have to admit, I really didn't start paying attention until about 6 or 7 years ago. I would do my civic duty and go down and vote for president, but that was really about it until, I had a situation where it started actually impacting my life. And so I just started taking a look downtown to see, okay, what can we do differently? And I found there's a fundamental disconnect between the way city government is run and what it should be happening with regards to the needs of the people.
Absolutely. It's so funny. It happens like that, right? It's like, oh man, politics is okay. President. And then something happens to you and you're like, okay, now I understand why they say all politics is local.
It's exactly right. But you know what? I use my experience to help engage other people because I know that we're so busy. And, here in South Bend, just like all over, especially the working people, we have 2 and 3 jobs sometimes and, raising our kids, everything's going on. And we feel like, oh, well, it's too busy. I'm too busy to really get involved. And really, the truth is we're too busy not to get involved. Because
that's so true.
By getting involved is how it's going to actually make our lives easier.
It's interesting, and I'm sure you as a woman of color and a Black woman specifically can understand this. So I worked with Bernie Sanders in 2016, and there was a huge argument that he was poor with the Black people, which, I mean, like, if you want to say he has work to do, he's an old white guy. Okay, he's always going to have work to do in that regard. But people would say that Black people didn't like him. And I was explaining that our mainstream was doing a disservice because if you are from a family, a Black family where you've seen single mothers having to work 2 or 3 jobs, they don't have time to go onto Facebook and Twitter to figure out what the real issues are. Exactly. And so when CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News aren't giving, good candidates that would help our situation, the right exposure, it is actually censorship and is doing a disservice. So what you said resonates 100%.
Well, you're exactly right. Well, I was a Bernie delegate in 2016. I had the proud honor of doing that. So I came to start paying attention through a mutual friend, a Black woman, who said, "Hey, you got to check out this old white guy. He's doing some real things, And that really, I got on board and just, jumped right in. But you're absolutely right. I mean, what I find locally here in South Bend, and it's probably the same in other communities, is, people of color, like, we're very emotional and we're very we're into relationships. And so often we're just voting for the person of color, or we're just voting for that person because they're a friend of mine. And we really have to get outside of that, He looks a certain way, but we really have to begin to listen to the message. And even I've got some friends now who's like, yeah, I was Bernie last time, but, I don't know. He really doesn't get the race issue on a deep level. And I'm like, well, you know what? At least he's got it on his platform in a way that I can absolutely resonate with. And so I'm really excited about him throwing his hat back in the ring and doing it.
Bernie, I mean, Bernie is not perfect on race, you know, he's not, but at the end of the day, I mean, what candidate absolutely right now do we have that is absolutely perfect on race, right?
That's right.
And it's the only thing that I ask of anybody really is just to, you know, admit that you have some growing to do and give yourself room to grow, and then we can work from there, right? Like, so for example, he's not perfect on foreign policy either, which is a big issue for me. But the other night, you know, he said that that's actually something he needs to work on, and he is very open about it. Tulsi Gabbard's great on foreign policy. I'm sure she has some things that she needs. Lately, it hasn't seemed like she doesn't have much she needs to work on, but you know, I'm sure she has some things she needs to work. It takes a lot to say I'm sorry, and when we have candidates who can do that, and we have two right now who can, that's a big deal. Like, even for you to be willing to admit, I didn't start paying attention until it happened to me, and that's wrong. I don't want other people to have to deal with that, which is why you're running for the office you're running for today. So what is your platform? If you got elected right now, what would be the first thing that you did?
Well, I have to tell you, in these last 3.5 years on the Common Council, I've learned a big lesson. One, the main thing that I've learned is that you can't make effective policy without engaging and talking to the people who your decisions are going to impact the most. Because generally, if you think about it, a person who's experiencing a problem, they're usually an expert on that problem. And they usually have really good ideas about how to solve the problem, what's going to fix it. What they don't have are the resources and maybe the connections downtown to actually implement those solutions. And so what I found is, you know, we spend a lot of time in city government. We're passing resolutions, proclamations, even some ordinances, and we pat ourselves on the back and say, wow, look at what we did. We really addressed that issue. But we never really go back to make sure that there's actually been some impact on the people. And so, you know, when I decided to run, I'm an activist at heart. You know, I'm really about, you know, I've been a teacher for 20 years, organizing in neighborhoods and in community around various different critical social issues. So I've always been on the outside, kind of like knocking down the door, you know, trying to get in. And there was an opportunity, somebody suggested it. And I said, well, you know, what would it mean if one of us was actually on the inside and we could go in and just like unlock that door and, you know, make it happen. So,
yeah, that's true. I mean, look at what happened. It's happened so often all over the country. You know, it's one thing to have somebody look like you in office, but it's another thing who understands what that experience means and how to approach it. So,
I was at the house party last night, and we were somebody talked about this issue of privilege, and I think that's really important for all of us to understand. You know, yes, I'm a woman of color. Yes, maybe I grew up in a certain neighborhood, but you know, there are places that we have privilege, and anytime we need to step up and use that. And in my case, I have a husband who works really, really hard and takes care of business at home. So I can afford to, in my years working for the school corporation, speak up and push on issues like school to prison pipeline and call people out and talk about the data. And so in that place of privilege, when I have that husband who's taking care of the finances, I know I'm not going to starve. It's not going to be good. You know, I'm not. But we all have to do those things. We all have to recognize where we can stand up and support.
You know, that's life experience for you right there, because a lot of people, they don't really understand. Like, so for example, privilege does have a racial component, does have a gender component, but there are many different types of privileges that we all have. And the only way that our country and our cities are going to get back to what we need to is if we recognize it. Like, for example, I'm Black, but I am fairer skinned. And I came from a background where I did speech and debate, and I spoke at rallies and things like that. And so when I had a chance to get into this progressive space, and I'm really occupying a space that a lot of people have not been able to, right? Because we get relegated to only talking about Black issues.
Right.
So that was the thing that kind of made me, whenever I had a choice to do this or give up law school, like you had a choice to stay in your profession or do this, I was like, this is an opportunity that not everybody has. And if I don't take advantage of it, just like you feel the same way, you know, we could get, you know, that's life experience will teach you that. Because at first you kind of get into this, if I'm not that person, then I don't have privilege at all. And that's not necessarily the case.
That's right. That's right. So we all have to look at that. And I think one of the things that brought me to politics, you know, was this issue of housing in South Bend. And again, like I said, it wasn't until something started happening to me and I started to really get at this issue of, what's happening in the neighborhood. You heard about the 1,000 houses in 1,000 days and that issue. And so homes were being demolished all around. In that moment, my family was experiencing a sudden and traumatic financial crisis. My husband almost died and couldn't work for years. And so we were in a particular situation. But what I knew, like when I started to see what was happening, it wasn't just happening to me, it was happening to my neighbors, people all around. And it kind of opened my eyes to what's going on in town besides just my own personal experience. I knew that, okay, my husband's on the mend. We've both got the education and the experience. I could see a light at the end of the tunnel, But the truth is, when we look at the numbers in South Bend, like we pushed and got the racial wealth divide report, for example. And we wanted to know by the numbers what's actually happened for people of color in South Bend. And one of the startling statistics was that, African Americans in South Bend live in poverty at twice the rate of African Americans all over the country.
What?
Yes, like that's real. And I'm glad you had.
Don't y'all have somebody from South Bend running for president? I feel like I might be affected by that.
I think I've heard of that.
I might need to let me write that statistic down real quick.
Copy of the report, because there were a lot of things in there. 37% of Black households in South Bend have zero net wealth. And so there's something very special, and not in a good way, that's happening for African Americans in South Bend. And so when I'm looking in my neighborhood, and there's mostly Black and brown people where I live, and I'm experiencing these issues with regards to homes coming down, most people experience or hold their wealth in their households, right? In their homes. And so when we're seeing that, you have to ask those questions. So for me, I knew that there was the light at the end of the tunnel. But I realized that for my neighbors, this is a perpetual situation. I mean, we were at the point where I was literally I learned how to go to the plasma center, get $20 to put gas in the car and keep it moving. And but what I realized was that was the experience of most of the people in my neighborhood every single day. And they didn't really see an end to that.
There was no chance. I know it's around the country too. And
right.
It really is. And I tell people that all the time. I say, whenever I'm going through something, which I was homeless 2 years ago. Wow. And I said, what the craziest, I had my car, right? Wow. I had an iPad and I had Netflix. And I said, you know what? I have a car that I can turn my air conditioner on when I go to sleep at night. Mm-hmm. And I know that with my skill and my degree, I'm going to get out of this. Exactly. But there are so many people who have no opportunity whatsoever.
Exactly.
And you got to, people like you who stand up and recognize that and decide, you know what, I'm not standing for this anymore.
That's right.
That is, thank you. Thank you for running. And it's after you have that experience and then you internalize that and run, that's amazing. Right. It really is.
Right. Well, and if not me, who? If not now, when, right? Famous quote. And I think that if we all take up that kind of perspective, that this is going to be a much better place, the world in general. And this is how, and not being afraid of this issue, because, we're talking about the plight of African Americans in South Bend. That report, the racial wealth divide, really shared with us that African Americans and Latinos are just lagging way behind. We knew that,
Mm-hmm. But what percentage of South Bend is African American and Latino?
What is it? 20%, 27%, I believe.
That's a lot.
African American, Latino. Whoa, I think it's 16%.
So y'all basically cumulatively, y'all make up almost half of the entire city, but y'all are feeling the repercussions of
exactly.
Wow.
So this is one of the reasons I'm actually running for mayor. I think I've been really effective on the council, and I had some time to everybody who's running, and there's a lot of us. I've worked with them in one way or another. But
I'll be honest with you. Mm-hmm. I've never even heard of any of the other candidates, and that's probably a good thing.
You hadn't heard of me either, though. The truth is, it is South Bend. But
no, but I was aware of your campaign.
Right. Okay.
I'm not aware of anybody. I don't. If you ask me what the two other people's names are right now amongst progressive circles, they have no idea who they are, but a lot of them do know who you are. So that's a good thing.
I think it's because I've had the courage to push back, and and do it in a way that's productive. Do it in a way that's effective, because there's a way in which, we have to hold our leaders accountable, but that doesn't mean if we disagree on something, that doesn't mean you're a horrible person. And that's where I think we've gotten to in politics and in life in general. If I disagree with you on one point, I have to make sure everybody knows you're an evil person. That way I win my argument.
There's a way to critique someone as an ally rather than, you know, just ripping them down. I think it's honestly, I think it's an American culture thing that we have going on. Like there has to be a good guy and a bad guy.
Exactly.
There can't be anything in between.
Who did it wrong? And let's destroy them, you know, in order to make our own point.
Meanwhile, the real bad guys get off, you know, like bandits.
Meanwhile, the real bad, and that was the issue, you know, here, because I've had a lot of national attention, you know, and a lot of that comes from Pete's, you know, run and his focus on South Bend being a turnaround city. And so since I was pretty much, you know, one of the only voices kind of really willing to just say, well, but what about this? Like, let's look at these issues in a real way. Let's, you know, data is really important, but data is only as good as the data you choose to look at. And data is only as good as how your analysis of that data. So just being willing to question and really to push the envelope. Now, it was not just me. It was also, you know, other local activists and organizations who had the ability to kind of really using political strategy, honestly. Like I said, I'm just getting into this, but I've been learning from so many people, young people, old people who was in the movement back in the 60s, you know, young people who just coming out of grad school, all fired up, you know, and, you know,
hey, look, nothing to fire you up like some student debt, I'm telling you.
I believe that for sure. So, you know,
can you give an example of like, so Pete said that it's a turnaround city. Can you give an example of something that he said was a turnaround, but in reality, there needs to be more context given to it?
I think that, you know, I've talked a lot about the 1,000 Houses, 1,000 Days, for example. I think that there were a lot of really good things, like everybody.
Hey, can you break that down for the audience so that people know what that means?
1,000 Houses and 1,000 Days was an initiative Pete talks about when he first was elected his first term. And he was out knocking on doors, talking to people. People were concerned about the vacant and abandoned homes. And there's lots and lots of vacant and abandoned homes all over the city, most specifically in the areas of Black and brown communities, in the poor areas, the outside of the neighborhoods downtown. And so that was his goal. It was like, okay, well, we're going to address these issues. And it's like, okay, that's great, because everybody wants revitalization throughout our neighborhoods. But the goal, his initial goal was, well, we're just going to knock down 1,000 houses. And it's like, okay, well, you know, like a kindergartner could have come up with that one, right? Okay, and so one of the first questions that we had was, well, what about affordable housing? Like, if we actually renovated some of these homes, you know, we could actually make sure that we had some affordable housing for people, because people are struggling. So that was like our first little victory there, to say, okay, we do want revitalization, you know, but how do we go about that in a way that's going to be neighborhood friendly and
rather than resulting in gentrification?
And so that was kind of the first victory. It's like, we're going to renovate some of these homes. But, you know, as we move forward, you know, if you look at we've got all the data behind it, you know, if, you know, one of the major tools was using aggressive code enforcement. And what that means is basically, okay, we're going to turn up the notch. We're going to increase the fines. So they went from like $250 for a fine for not fixing up something on your house to like $2,500. And that's an astronomical change that really makes a difference between a person's ability to actually pay that fine and move forward, or they might actually end up losing their home, because the process goes like this. If you don't fix it up within so many months, then you get a fine. That continues until next thing you know, you've got, you know, that literally like $10,000 in debt. Like that happened to people.
Oh, wow.
And then if you don't pay those fines, because you couldn't fix up your house because you didn't have the money to do that, you generally don't have the money to fix up to pay the fines. Then after 2 years, those fines get attached to your tax bill as a special assessment.
Whoa! So now you have a lien.
So now, if you don't pay those fines, then your house goes to tax sale and you lose your house. Now, one of the things that the administration constantly says, oh, well, nobody really lost their home because these were vacant homes. But this is where the fundamental disconnect comes in. Because what I know, living in those neighborhoods and talking to people, is that people weren't living in those homes because they were dilapidated. They were uninhabitable. But many of the people who own those homes were individuals that maybe they had inherited those homes from their family members. And if they had the money, they would certainly fix those up, move in, or move some family members in. And so those were the types of things. That was the type of data that wasn't collected. And that's the kind of, you know, again, understanding, you know, and this is what I think.
Understanding who you're working for, basically.
Like real life and the lived experience of real people. So, you know, it's one thing to collect data and look at research and say, oh, this is how they did it in Baltimore. But that's what I talk about all the time. Well, if we do what we've always done, we're going to get what we've always gotten. And all over the country, not just in South Bend, the tools of economic development have gotten us gentrification, displacement.
You know, it would have been probably a better idea, in my humble opinion. You temporarily waive fines for X amount of years and give credits to people who own property or for like these dilapidated or however, you know, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 per person who owns these properties. That could change everything for some people.
Everything. And, you know, there were a lot of ideas given. People talked about the dollar house program that we had in the past. You know, how can we make sure that people get actual assistance and help to fix up their homes? And again, it's like, this is what I'm saying. When I got downtown, it's like we create an ordinance or we create a process and we paint this broad brush without really truly understanding what's happening in the neighborhoods. And so that's what I've found. And that's going to be a key cornerstone of my administration. We're going to strengthen neighborhood associations throughout this city and use that as a central organizing principle to address all of our critical social issues. Because like I said, once you're on the ground and you know what's happening in those neighborhoods, the people can actually help inform you in terms of the priorities, ideas about solutions, and better understand that problem and better implement solutions. So we've got, we're going to be working on education, reducing violence by building peace. We'll be working on, of course, the housing and economic development, providing jobs, all through a better connection with people on the ground in the neighborhoods.
That sounds awesome. Now, for education, one of the biggest flaws about the public school system, which in my understanding was actually race-based, is like 93% of all funding comes from the neighborhoods, basically.
Right.
You know, so because of this, the other problem that you have that runs parallel to that, which is the housing problem, how are you going to address that challenge? Is there going to be some fundamental restructuring of how your schools are paid for, or what do you have in mind?
Well, the decisions on how schools are paid for are made downstate. And that's what I say. I mean, there's lots of ways that the city is going to support schools. I mean, we're going to, you know, all the early childhood, make sure there's funding for early childhood and pre-K, make sure that housing, you talked about it. When we stabilize the neighborhoods, that's going to eliminate one of the biggest problems with a child's education, is because in South Bend, another statistic I have for you, we're number 18 of all cities in the country for evictions. Okay, little old South Bend. Right. And those are just the ones that actually go through court. So our families, being a teacher, I see it all the time. Our families are not just maybe homeless or housing instability, but they're moving constantly. So when their child moves,
your teachers,
I'm sorry.
You said your teachers are having to move?
No, I'm saying I'm a teacher.
Oh, I thought you said the teachers are having. I'm like, good God, that's not good.
A whole nother thing. But no, I'm a teacher, so I see it in the schools all the time. The families are constantly moving. We have something like a turnover rate in classrooms of around 30% from who started in the fall to who's taking the standardized test in the spring. So this is a huge problem. So when we stabilize neighborhoods, then we're going to be able to support schools as well. But the greatest challenge for public schools in Indiana is really the systematic defunding that's happening from the laws downstate. What's happening in Indiana downstate, that's like the whole Mike Pence, like all that kind of legislation that's going on with education. That's actually creating a proliferation of charter schools and vouchers. Vouchers, if you're not familiar, that's where we take public school dollars and allow families to pay for a private school education. And in Indiana, the last statistic I saw was somewhere around 60% of vouchers in Indiana are actually used by people who never sent their child to public school in the first place. So it becomes a subsidy.
Wow.
So these are the types of insidious policies and legislation that's happening downstate. And because that's happening, because people are like, well, you know, the schools and the city, they really are two separate bodies. But the truth is, and right now we're experiencing essentially a takeover from the state for some of our failing schools because of this longstanding problem and nobody addressing it. And so it's really what's happening downstate is not happening anywhere in the country around this kind of policy for education. And so it's really the city has to step in. We have to act to make sure that we're galvanizing the public schools from this systematic defunding. And the way we're going to do that, I'm actually starting this as a city council person now. We're creating a commission on education. And because we have to realize that South Bend Schools is not the only, I mean, the public school system is not the only game in town anymore. We've got charter schools. We got a new charter high school starting in 2020.
Isn't that crazy that there's so many? It's like, okay, we don't have that much money to spend on public schools to begin with. And so instead of saying we need to invest in making sure these public schools are taken care of, no, let's take more money away from the public schools and then give them to these people who never wanted anything to do with public schools to begin with. It's ridiculous.
It's problematic, but it's about money, right? Yeah. Somebody's making money.
From your houses, from your house dollars. Like, it's crazy.
Exactly, it is. But people don't have a deep understanding of how those things work. And so they're able to kind of get these things by. They sell it like, oh, school choice. Well, everybody should have the opportunity to send their kids to the best schools. So we're going to attach the dollars to the child. And so those are the ways that they sell. That's the propaganda around it. So what we're going to do as a neutral body, the city still doesn't have any legal jurisdiction over any of these institutions that are educating our kids with public dollars. But what we do is we do have a bully pulpit, and we do have the ability to leverage relationships to bring everybody to the table. We're going to work from our values. We're as a central body that has an investment in all kids learning. We're going to create this education commission on education and bring the traditional public schools, the charter schools, and the private schools together at the same table and say, look, we all want to make sure that all kids learn. So how can we make sure that here in South Bend, we're sharing resources, we're working together to make sure that that happens. So when we come from our shared values, instead of competing over kids and over dollars, we're going to be working together to make sure that we get it right.
That's amazing. I'm glad you have a plan to deal with that. Now, the two things I want to ask before we go is, how do you plan? What is your take on minimum wage? Because I know because of the lack of, there's no federal safety net for the minimum wage. Therefore, it affects every city differently right now. What is your take on that? And then two, if you could tell us about the police chief situation from a South Bender's perspective, and how you would like to see that, not happen next time.
Right. So with regards to the issue of wages in the state of Indiana, they do not allow municipalities to create their own minimum wage. And so we're kind of
right to work. Gotta love it.
Right. You got it.
But Republicans, right? Oh, but they love letting the market determine wages. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So what we have to make sure that we're doing here is, and again, as the mayor, we can leverage our relationship with some of the largest employers in the city to make sure that we're asking them to be good corporate citizens and do the right thing by their workers. So, I've been organizing a lot with unions. I am in the teachers union, and we pushed to make sure even the schools, even though we don't have a whole lot of money and we understand what's happening there, that not just the teachers, but all the school workers, anybody who touches kids, are increasing their wages. But what we have to do is we also have to think creatively. We have to think about what resources do we have already in this town. Not every town has it, but we do. We have hospitals and we have universities, world-class universities right here in South Bend. And all of these institutions spend billions of dollars on goods and services that largely go outside of our community. And so what we're going to do is we're going to capture some of those dollars and funnel them right back here into South Bend. We're going to tap those supply lines. And we talk about, again, remember I talked about neighborhoods as a central organizing principle. This is how we're going to build jobs. Because I know that when I live like 8 blocks from my mom, right? I'm driving there every day. And in that short little span, there's the guy who fixes large appliances in his backyard. There's a guy who's got his shade tree mechanic, the woman who sells tamales out of her house, and you've got the candy store. There's a whole invisible economy that's going on because the low wages in South Bend, people have 1 or 2 maybe low wage jobs, but they're still kind of on the hustle, trying to put that extra piece in there to make sure that they can survive. So they have hard work. They have a hard work ethic. They have ingenuity. They have all of the things necessary. What they don't have is a connection downtown to get the resources they need to move their business from the backyard to the storefront. And that's what we're going to do here in South Bend. We're going to make sure we're connecting with people to get the resources they need. Generally, those resources go to the same people, that good old boys network. But we're going to connect with people and make sure that they're brought into this mainstream economy. And that's going to lift everybody up. We're also going to be looking at like the Cleveland model in Cleveland and Rochester, New York. They've been working on creating worker-owned cooperatives, where they're putting these multi-million-dollar facilities in the middle of the most depressed neighborhood. And they're able to tap those institutions. So, for example, in Cleveland, I think it might have started with the commercial laundry. All of these hospitals and universities use commercial laundry. And what the mayor did is say, you know what? We want you to pledge 10% of your business for 10 years to this multi-million-dollar business we're putting here. And then they figured out how can they built the facility right in the middle of the hood. They figured out how legally they could hire only people within a certain radius. So now you got 100 workers, let's say, and they actually own that business. So they've given consulting, they're given, all the support they need to grow a good business. They don't have to worry about where my client's coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And so now that completely transforms that whole neighborhood, because not only those folks who can now borrow against it, they've got a living wage, they can make sure their kids are getting what they need for enrichment in school, but that facility now creates other businesses, because we need sandwich shops, we need coffee shops and things like that. And it's worked in other cities, and it's going to work right here in South.
I actually worked in Brooklyn. That's one of the things that Jay-Z, before he helped build the Brooklyn Nets arena, like he made it so that they had to hire people from that area to work in the arena.
That's what we're talking about. That's what we're talking about. And that's how we're going to increase wages. This is how we're going to make sure that South Bend is where it needs to be. Now, your other question was about the issue with the police tapes.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to tell you, we've been dealing with, I don't know, what has it been, 7 years? I don't know. It's like crazy. And millions of dollars addressing these issues. But, Pete has got a lot of work to do. A lot of flack. People are saying, well, you fired the first African-American chief of police, and they're looking at this issue as, okay, this was a mistake, and now what are you going to do differently? What I believe is that, whatever happens with those tapes, whatever happened, yes, there's a lot of questions around that. But I think one of the things we have to begin to do is really look at the meta conversation. We have to look at this from a deeper perspective, because we can make a mistake here, firing that police chief. We can make a mistake. Maybe we didn't address the issue where that particular police officer, maybe he should have been fired for beating that young man in the face in the middle of the night, the 17-year-old. That's a whole nother thing. But we're going to continue to make those mistakes until we start really looking at this for what it is. And what this is an issue that goes far beyond Pete Buttigieg. This is an issue that's about historical racism and institutional oppression. And so until we start having that dialogue and really electing leaders that understand those issues at that level, then we're going to continue to make these mistakes over and over again and hash those out. So as critical as that decision was in terms of the relationship that, for example, that particular mayor, Pete Buttigieg, had with the African-American community, and it did cause a rift, and it's still looming because this whole concept of the tapes and what's on the tapes and the cover-ups and the money that's being dealt out to folks, there's a lot of work to be done there. But I believe that if we're looking at, okay, what does that mean for Pete and his run? What does that mean? I get the questions all the time, can Black people trust Pete Buttigieg? What we have to do is make sure that we're looking at beyond these individual incidences and questioning the fact is, you said it earlier, not everybody's perfect on race. Nobody's perfect on race. But are you willing to have the conversations and do the work that's necessary to have a deeper understanding of how your decisions impact and actually are coming from this legacy of racism and institutional oppression? So that's the conversation that we need to begin having. And until we do, we're going to continue to make those mistakes. But that's how in South Bend, under my administration, we will be a model for America, because we're not afraid to have those conversations. And we're going to elevate the conversation, and we're going to deepen our understanding so that all the leaders in South Bend, as we're making decisions, we're moving forward in a different way. That's about equity and inclusion.
That's amazing. And it looks like, you're going to be quite a beacon. And I'm really wishing you luck going forward, because right now I feel like the Rust Belt doesn't have somebody that they can point to and say, okay, we need to do this, because I'm sure because of, the makeup of Indiana, that places like Wisconsin, definitely Michigan, and others are going through similar issues in some of their most popular cities. And then we have corrupt politicians and big money interests coming in to try and sweep over it and take over, right?
Right.
And we don't want that to happen. And it's great that, out of the ashes, you have somebody from the city who has been there and was, dealt with the consequences of bad decision making and some federal things that had nothing to, you had no control over, to rise from the ashes and say, you know what, this is our town. It's time to take it back. So where can people donate to your campaign?
Please check out the website, www.rwpformayor.com. This is about big money. That's what this is about. I mean, we've got 2 other candidates. One is endorsed by Pete. So we've got the Pete machine going.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, the other is actually stepped down from being the chair of the Democratic Party in St. Joe County. And so now he's running. So we've got the whole Democratic machine, we've got Pete machine, and there's big, big money on those 2 ends. So, you know, every little bit helps, every little bit counts. We're going to make it happen because we are definitely a people-powered campaign right now.
So I have a question.
Yes.
Did the Democratic Party chair, did they step down after you announced?
Actually, you know what? That's a good question. No, I think he stepped down before, but you see, he's been planning to run for mayor for a long time. We've known that Pete was only here for a bit. You know, we knew that this was kind of a stepping stone. That wasn't a surprise to anyone. But I think that that's where, you know, we have to start challenging these systems because, you know, the current, the candidate who stepped down from being the chair of the party, you know, he's been looking at doing this for a long time. So, you know, he's cashing in some favors now, you know.
That's how they do. That's how they do.
And, you know, if we're ever going to do something about this Democratic Party, if we're ever going to change things and make sure that it does what it needs to do, we have to start electing new leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. And it needs to be leadership that isn't trying to use your, you know, whatever it is as a stepping stone, whether it be gubernatorial. I'm from Florida. We dealt with Rick Scott. That is, Lord, our water is poison. Like, you know what I'm saying? We have poisonous water because this man literally came in, screwed the entire state, pretending as if he was somebody different, and then dipped to the Senate. Like that, you know, and we're left to deal with the consequences of that. So I'm very glad that they have somebody in South Bend that seems that they're going to be there for the long run. So once again, let everybody know where they can donate to you.
www.rwpformayor.com. Check us out. Come in, like everything you see, and just drop a few dollars on us. Help us out.
drop a few dollars, people.
That's right.
Go right now. And just to let you know, in case anybody was wondering, I personally endorse Regina because this is what I want to see happening across the country. It's what we've seen started about 3 to 4 years ago, but we need to see it really now more than ever. Because it isn't just the presidency. I'm telling you, I'd say, like, whenever people were asking me, well, you know, I didn't vote for either Hillary or Trump. I voted for Jill Stein. And then people say, well, what happens if Trump gets in office? I say like this: Alabama is not going to turn into New York if Hillary wins, and New York isn't going to turn into Texas because Trump wins. It starts right in your town, in your municipality, in your state. And you have to be the change. Stop waiting for somebody else to do it. So thank you for being that change. For everybody else, always remember, more than anything else, find your balance.
That's right. Thank you.